Welcome back to Giant Monster Games. I'm Adrian, and today we are doing a new series called Revisited and Reteched, where we go and look at an old deck that I've done in the past and look at ways of upgrading it, specifically by using comments provided by you guys. So, if you are interested in having your comments featured on one of these episodes, feel free to go and comment on other decks on what you think would be good upgrades or things that may be able to add it to the deck. But before we actually get started, if you are interested in picking up this deck or any of the decks on the channel, go over to Flipside Gaming and use promo code Giant Monster Games to get 10% off your online purchase. Okay, something to note about the deck is we are actually increasing the budget from $50 to $60. The extra budget is 100% necessary, trust me. Also, if you do want to go take a look at the last deck, feel free up in the top hand corner there is a link to it. You can go take a look at it. Be advised, it was one of my first decks I've ever put on this channel, so it is a little rough around the edges. It's not quite as polished as most of the decks on the channel are nowadays, so feel free to go take a look at that because I'm not going to go over the entire deck. I'm just going to be going over the actual changes. Speaking of changes, let's talk about what is actually being upgraded in the deck. Well, viewer Tempest and the computer actually pointed out that Ghostly Prison is actually cheaper now than Norn's Annex, specifically because it was reprinted recently and it is now substantially cheaper. Like, it is actually a full-on budget card now, and Ghostly Prison is hands down better than Norn's Annex. So Norn's Annex, they can pay life or they can pay 1 white mana, where Ghostly Prison forces them to pay 2 mana no matter what. So what was actually happening with Norn's Annex is decks like Death Shadow and Tron don't really care that they're going to pay 2 life, because in a lot of cases it doesn't make any difference, because paying 2 life to swing in and win the game generally means you're paying 2 life to swing in and win the game. So Ghostly Prison forces your opponent to actually have a bunch of extra mana, and it substantially slows most decks down comparatively. Cards that are being taken out, on the other hand, we have Stasis Snare and Return to the Ranks that are both coming out. They were both a little bit too slow for me and I didn't quite like them. Stasis Snare, if I'm going to be paying 3 mana to get rid of something, I would like to be getting rid of something more than just a creature. I know Flash is really good and Flash is a fantastic ability, but in reality we could be using Path to Exile, which is just so much better, or in this case we could be using Banishing Light, which is actually what we're going to do. Return to the Ranks, on the other hand, is just not that good. I mean, we have a lot of stuff that is 1-drops, and Proclamation of Rebirth is going to be grabbing those 1-drops, and realistically, Sun Titan is just a better value card when it comes to actually doing this exact same effect, because lots of times we're paying 5-6 mana to get this, and we're only getting like 3 creatures back. So why not take out Return to the Ranks, and this gets us into where we're going to be adding cards in. Why don't we add in another Sun Titan? So now we are going to be running 2 copies of Sun Titan, because it is way too good not to be running, because Sun Titan's ability is whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, we get to return any permanent with converted mana cost 3 or less from our graveyard to play. So generally you think, okay, I'm going to return a creature. I mean, I could use another Ajani's Pridemate or Squadron Hawk or something like this, but that is the wrong way of looking at this. You need to be thinking, if this is the late game and I'm swinging with my Sun Titan, which is normally going to be late game by the time we're playing this, you want to be grabbing stuff like a Ghostly Prison or another Banishing Light, or in a lot of cases you want to be getting Honor the Pure, because that's what's going to allow you to actually win the game, and it's just so much better, guys. It is so much better. I highly, highly recommend it. And if you are going up against a deck like Tron and you get to the late game where you're playing this, you can be grabbing your Ghost Quarters out of your graveyard and then killing off their lands every single turn, which is totally going to slow them down and not really affect you very much. And speaking of Ghost Quarter, we are going to be running the full 4 set of these before. Originally we had 3 in the deck. I think running 22 lands will give us a little bit more consistency with getting Sun Titan out, and it allows us to have a more main board hate for Tron and other decks that are running man lands, such as Infect, or, 3-color decks where we want to get rid of one of their lands, so it slows them down just at least a little bit. But the biggest changes for this deck are all in the sideboard. I'm not going to lie to you guys, when I made this deck tech, I was not very good at building sideboards. Now I think I'm much better, so let's go through what is actually in the new sideboard, because it is way more geared at dealing with the current meta and way more geared at dealing with most decks in general. So we have 2 copies of Aven Mindcensor. He is dealing with combo, he is dealing with a lot of different stuff. If you're going up against a deck that is using a lot of fetch lands, this guy almost stops all fetch lands in general. Also, it helps us deal with Tron, which is something that I always think of when I'm building decks nowadays. 3 copies of Brave the Elements. This is helping us against control decks where they're going to be trying to wipe our board, because all of our white creatures get protection from the color of our choice. We can also use this to swing in for lethal if we need to, because we can always say protection from green, and if our opponent is playing a couple Charmaglyphs and stuff like this, they can't block our creatures because we now have protection from that color. Obviously, if you're playing against a deck that is 3 or 4 colors, so a Zoo deck or a Naya deck, I mean, a little bit harder to do, but in some cases this is going to be really relevant for you. 2 copies of Celestial Purge. This is black black and red hate, I'm specifically looking at stuff like Death Shadow, Vexing Devil, and most burn decks. 1 copy of Day of Judgment. This is a board wipe in case we're going against a go-wide strategy, or we're going up against something like Eldrazi Tron, where we just don't have any good removal for their stuff, because we don't have any real good way of dealing with something like Worldbreaker. 2 copies of Disenchant. This is just strictly better than Revoke Existence, which is what we were running before, because it was technically more budget, but Disenchant is pretty budget as it is. 2 copies of Kami of the False Hope. This is a really good card if we're going against other aggro decks that are using a lot of creatures, because we can just sacrifice it, prevent all combat damage, so no infect, no go-wise strategies, no big creature decks, and if we have a Sun Titan or a Proclamation of Rebirth in our hand, we could, in theory, once we get to the late game, just prevent our opponent from ever actually dealing combat damage ever again until they actually exile this card. So they are really good against those kind of decks. 1 copy of Secure the Wastes. This is really good because if we need to gain a bunch of life right away, we can play this guy and get a whole bunch of creatures in play. Also, it allows us to go wide if we really just need to go wide. Again, we're only running 1 copy of this because it's not the most important card in the deck, but it is very good if we do need stuff in a pinch. Also, it's instant speed, which is fantastic. And lastly, 2 copies of Suppression Field. This is basically a combo killer. Any deck that is relying on activated abilities, such as Tron and a lot of other combo decks, we can just kill that straight away by making them having to pay an extra 2 mana, which is enough usually to make them not have a lot of fun. And that is the entire upgraded version of the deck, but I do want to talk about some of the things that you guys suggested and reasons why I didn't quite put them in the deck. The first thing we're going to talk about is a couple people asked about Aetherflux Reservoir. Now, this card is really cool and really interesting to brew around, but it doesn't quite work in our deck because we're not playing enough stuff in one turn to really build it up to make it go off right away. And playing a card where we need to play it this turn and then it'll take 2 or 3 turns before it's really going to go off is just not that effective. Usually you want to play stuff in Modern that when it comes into play or the turn you play it, it is going to win you the game, or it's going to let you win the game right away. You don't need to like wait around for a couple turns, and our Soul Sisters deck isn't geared towards us gaining a ton of life. The Martyr Life decks, on the other hand, tend to do that. They tend to gain an insane amount of life because they are completely geared towards just pumping out a ton of life because they want to be playing stuff like Sarah's Ascendant, which is going to get really big, and that's how they're actually going to be winning the game. So it doesn't quite work in this deck, but I may try and brew around it in the future to see if I can actually make it work a little bit better. The next question I got was from Manuel, and he asked about Lone Rider / It That Rides. So this is a transforming card if you're not familiar with it, and it is actually really good in this deck because it's really easy for us to transform this, so right away we can be getting a relatively good beater on the table. I didn't go for it because I thought that playing with flyers is actually a little bit better, so I didn't put it in. Mind you, this is a completely viable option and I would highly recommend trying it out if you are building this deck, but again, my personal opinion was I think having some evasion to win the game because we are a budget deck was a little bit more important. Then we have Steve that actually suggested running Emeria the Sky Ruins. Now this card is absolutely fantastic in this deck, and I highly recommend, if you have the money, totally upgrade to this because it allows you to basically get more graveyard recursion. It's basically doing something similar to what Sun Titan and Proclamation of Rebirth are doing for us, where it allows us to get late game recursion because we are playing a Soul Sisters deck. The entire point of our deck, it is completely to allow ourselves to live long enough to get to the late game so we can actually do all the stuff with Sun Titan and other big creatures. So Emeria the Sky Ruin, highly recommend it. There's also a couple creatures that come along with Emeria the Sky Ruin. I'm just going to put them up on the screen here. You guys can take a look at them. There are really good synergies with it. If you are trying to get all of the planes into the battlefield right away, this is a really good way of doing it. And then Scried for Your Sins asked about playing Brimaz, which is really good in this deck. Putting in 2 Brimaz in place of 2 Doomed Travelers is really good because he creates a lot of little tokens which then become really hard for your opponent to deal with. And again, if we have a Sun Titan and Brimaz dies, we can always pull him back. That's the nice thing about Sun Titan, is he can get back most of the creatures that are already in the upgrade section. Then we had Papa ask about Always Watching. Now, Always Watching is not actually a very good card for this deck because we have about 50-50. Half of our creatures are tokens, half of our creatures are non-tokens, so it just doesn't work very well. And honestly, a deck like this doesn't want too many Anthem effects. Running 4 Honor the Pure is probably all we really need in the deck because we're not aiming to win on doing a whole bunch of really big damage. We don't need to be swinging in with like 5/5s or 4/4s. Realistically, swinging with 1/1s and 2/2s is really what's going to win us the game because we're aiming to do a lot of little damage over a whole bunch of of turns, and that's how we're going to win, because our deck is going to allow us to go wide no matter what, because we are gaining a ton of life. Then we had Matthew asking about Promise of Burial? I don't really know how to pronounce that word, but it's okay. This card doesn't work in the deck. I'm sorry, it is way too slow, because we are relying on playing this enchantment, which is not cheap, and then having something die. If we had a sack engine, if we were playing an Aristocrats deck, this might be an option, but it is just not an option in a Soul Sisters deck where we don't have any way of killing off our stuff. The same thing goes for Mozilla Toast, which was asking about Rally the Ancestors. It is just not a good card in a Soul Sisters deck because we don't have a way of actually killing off all of our stuff, because Rally the Ancestors brings all of our creatures back from our graveyard into play, but it doesn't allow us to swing in with them. They don't have haste, so we need to actually do something with them other than just gain a bunch of life. Otherwise, we're going to lose them all because they get exiled at the end of the turn. So this card has a lot of synergies with most of the Aristocrats decks, but Soul Sisters, it just doesn't work. And that is all of the questions that you guys actually had and all the things that were brought up that I changed about this deck. I hope you guys enjoyed this new series. Until next time, though, I am Adrian. This is Giant Monster Games. Thanks for watching, and until next time, don't forget to game like a giant monster.